It's the Ides of March, so let's talk Julius Caesar. Well, actually, let's talk about this. The pugio, the dagger which did it for him. Now, I should just point out that this is a reenactment. This is my reenactment one. It's not edged, so this couldn't be used other than quite a fancy paperweight more than anything else. But it still does look quite fearsome. And what's interesting is that though this became sort of an icon, and we'll see that on a coin in a minute, for sort of Roman freedom, it wasn't Roman. In fact, it was quite recently added to the Roman armoury, or weaponry. The origins of the pugio are most likely similar to that of the gladius, which is to say Celtiberian, northern modern-day Spain. It's thought that these were used by the locals there, the tribes that Rome was fighting, particularly in the 2nd century BC, where Rome was conducting numerous sort of military activities in northern Spain, and they were coming up across them. And the early finds that we have seem to indicate that this is sort of the birthplace of Rome, or rather the Roman legionaries starting to add this to their kit. What's interesting is not just what we find, but what we don't find. So we obviously have finds that indicate where these were used, but we can also see them on steles, tombstones, as it were, of soldiers. And these seem to be centered around sort of specific geographical areas. So Gaul, northern, what is modern-day Spain, as you'd expect, Germany, southern Roman Britain, these sorts of areas, but not much elsewhere. I mean, there are sometimes we find the odd one here or there, and we do occasionally find the odd stele or tombstone with a legionary or army officer or someone wearing one, but often we find that's not the case. And what that seems to be pointing to is that these were used not as standard Roman kit, but used in specific areas. And then you have to wonder, why were they being used in those specific areas? And there are a number of suggestions. So the idea or the arguments that support its use range from there were prestige weapons being handed out as a sort of, aren't I special, look how great I am, through to these were sort of backup weapons. In reality, though, it seems that it's more towards the idea of these being very useful in very specific scenarios, because the gladius, though its short sword, was still quite long. And we have Tacitus, we also have Diodorus Siculus mention their use. And when their use is mentioned, it tends to be in very tight, crammed fighting conditions. In fact, there's an incident, I think it's Tacitus, who talks about them being used by soldiers in the Year of the Four Emperors, so AD 69, and used against Germans who were trying to assault a Rome of 4. And the Romans are too boxed in, necessary to be able to use their gladius or gladi, so instead they use their pugio, which are far more effective in those kind of close quarter environments. I mentioned earlier about the pugio becoming iconic. Well, here it is in probably its most iconic depiction. That is to say, on the coin which celebrated the assassination of Julius Caesar. You've got two of them there flanking a pileus cap. Now, what I find particularly interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, originally this dagger had been something introduced to the Roman army. And 150 years later, or thereabouts, probably 100 years or so, it was now being used to sort of celebrate, as it were, a particularly a massive event in Roman history and essential to that event occurring. So again, it had been fully Romanized by this point, which is often what Romans did with, well, let's face it, other people's stuff or just other people's ideas.